name is Kenny Lowe. I'm Director of Multi-Cloud Evangelism at Dell Technologies. I've been, let's say, deep in this Microsoft hybrid journey and multi-cloud journey for about the past 7 years. About 7 years ago, actually in December 7 years ago, was when the very first technical preview of Azure Stack, now called Azure Stack Hub, was first dropped. And since then, I've been absolutely focused on delivering hybrid messaging and capabilities to as many people as I can get in front of and talk to. I won't spend too long talking about myself because, well, you don't care, but also because we want to make sure we spend enough time on the content. But you can hit me up on @KennyLowe on Twitter or @KennyLowe at mastodon.scot if you are migrating away from Twitter. I have multicloud.is there as well, where you can see some of my blogs as well. And I've been a Microsoft MVP for the last 6 years as well. No clicker. Okay. Tech is not on my side today. That's fine. We will do some live troubleshooting. Once a techie, always a techie. Isn't that right? There we go. So it's true to say that we are living in a multi-cloud world today. And when we say multi-cloud, we mean that you're using multiple cloud providers, multiple cloud services, multiple vendors, and whether that is Azure and AWS and Google or SAP and Microsoft 365 and there are different cloud capabilities that you're using. And people love these services. They love using them. And this is the most important thing I want you to take away from this slide, is that it is the services that matter. The reason you're using cloud is because of the services. It's not because of the location. You're not going to Azure because there is a data center in UK South or UK West. You're going there because there are specific services that you want to be able to use. And more, we're seeing people want to be able to take those same services and bring them anywhere. I want to be able to take Azure App Service and put it in my data center. I want to take Azure Logic Apps and put it in my data center. I want to take Azure SQL Managed Instances and run it at the edge, and. And we're seeing this real move from Microsoft and from partners like Dell to decouple Azure from Azure, to take away the idea that workloads and data centers and the Azure portal are tightly coupled, and decouple them so that you can have the Azure portal as a common management experience, but then choose where you run your workloads. And this is a slide which has been used over and over and over again to show Azure on a global scale. Look, there are 70 plus Azure regions. That's more than AWS and Google combined. Look at this wonderful map of Azure. But does it matter? Does it really matter where these Azure regions are? Does it matter where they're physically located? It doesn't. What matters is what you're doing with it, what you're wanting to achieve. One of the things that has definitely been a truism for public cloud for as long as public cloud has existed is that it has gatekept technological innovation inside these locations. So there have been unique capabilities which have been built, which have only been available within these specific locations. Things that you want to do, but you can only do if you move into those data center facilities. I mean, we could just take Azure SQL Managed Instances and compare that to on-premises SQL as a super quick and easy example. In Azure SQL Managed Instances, you have built-in HA and DR there. You have built-in backup mechanisms. You have built-in monitoring. You can scale very easily with a slider. How are you going to scale your SQL Server on-premises? Well, maybe you install a new OS and you sysprep it and you install SQL and you add it to your cluster and you expand and great, you've got your other SQL Server. In Azure, I can drag a slider. That's awesome. I want that on-premises. I want to take that capability and run it anywhere I want. And that's really the move that we're seeing just now with this decoupling of Azure from Azure, specifically through Azure Arc. And Azure Arc is this great enabler for decoupling Azure from being a location to being a capability that you can run anywhere. Azure Arc is really designed to be a single control plane that you can apply to any infrastructure, any workload, anywhere. And Azure Arc really does, well, a lot of different things in its portfolio, but I break it down into 2 buckets. So number one, it allows you to project your existing infrastructure into the Azure portal. So if you have any Windows or Linux servers running on premises, in AWS, in Google, in VMware, in wherever, anywhere, any Windows or Linux server, then you can install an agent on that, and as long as you have 443 open out from that, you can project that into the Azure portal. You can view that as an Azure resource then in portal.azure.com, and you can immediately start doing some things like Azure policy, Azure governance, tagging, and RBAC, and control, and management, and things that you would be doing on Azure virtual machines in your on-premises virtual machines. So there's an immediate value add to be had from doing that. And how much does it cost to install the Azure Arc agent for servers? Nothing. It's a free service. You install the Azure Arc service there, it projects into Azure, and you get some immediate benefit. Yes, there are costs for adding on other things. Of course there are. It's a freemium model there. But you get some immediate benefit by just installing those agents on your existing on-premises virtual machines there. I think that if we jump forward 3 or 4 years, we'll probably see a Gartner category for control plane as a service. I think that that is something which others are going to be looking at now. Microsoft is ahead in this space with Azure Arc, but I think that control plane as a service is going to really take off in the not too distant future. So projecting your existing infrastructure into Azure, yes, but also bringing Azure services down on premises as well. And that's getting really, really interesting just now. So this isn't every Azure service yet. There are a subset which are enabled, but they're not designed to be Azure-like or Azure Lite or kinda a bit like it. They're the exact same service. The enabler for bringing these Azure services on premise is Kubernetes. So any CNCF compliant Kubernetes infrastructure that you have on premises can be a landing zone for Azure services. So if I wanted to take Azure SQL managed instances and run them in my data center, as long as I have a Kubernetes environment there, I can point that Azure SQL MI to deploy into my data center rather than a Microsoft data center. And I maintain the same control plane, the same capabilities. It's the same service. Spoiler alert, when Microsoft deploy Azure SQL managed instances into their data center, that goes into Kubernetes. As long as you have Kubernetes, you're getting the same service. And segue there, I speak to a lot of people who say they have no interest in Kubernetes, they're not deploying Kubernetes, they're not doing anything with it just now, they don't have development teams, they're not going to be developing their own cloud-native applications. Why am I going to deploy Kubernetes? This is kind of the reason, because software vendors, hyperscalers, others are going to want to make their applications and their software available to you in a consistent way anywhere, and Kubernetes is the great enabler for that. How you deploy Kubernetes, now that's another great question which we will come to in a few slides' time. But even if you're never going to develop your own cloud-native applications, having a Kubernetes infrastructure is going to be super critical to enabling this sort of capability in the future. So you can project anything into Azure, any Windows or Linux virtual machine into Azure. You can bring some Azure services down on premises, and I can go through what all those are in a minute. I think I have them on the next slide. But the important thing is that when you're bringing these Azure Arc-enabled services down on premises, that can be onto any infrastructure that runs Kubernetes. So it could be a VMware one. It could be into EKS on AWS, for example. Yes, you can take Azure services and run them in Amazon natively and then control them from Azure. It's a crazy multi-cloud world here. Microsoft and Dell have been building a great platform for delivering this integration through Azure Stack HCI, but it's not the only way that we do this. So what we want to do is bring consistent operations, governance, and security with Azure. That is Azure Arc through the Azure portal. So you log on to portal.azure.com, and you have all those capabilities there. And we have validated basically every piece of Dell Technologies infrastructure to run Azure Arc services on. So whether it is PowerFlex, VxRail, Azure Stack HCI, PowerMax, PowerStore, and pretty much every Dell Technologies infrastructure capability is certified to run Azure Arc services. And yes, you could do them on Google, AWS, and others as well. This is a multi-cloud capability here. So yes, we can project those Windows and Linux servers in there. That's your first step. That's your kind of bait on the hook there, pull you into the Azure Arc capabilities there. But you can also install that Arc agent on a SQL server. So if you have a Windows server running SQL Server on it just now in your data center and you saw that Arc agent on it there, it'll project that into the Azure portal, but then it'll start giving you lots of information about the SQL instances as well. It'll start bringing Azure Advisor recommendations for your on-premises SQL just by virtue of the fact that you've installed that Azure Arc agent there. You're getting Azure value immediately in your on-premises workloads, things which have been locked inside a Microsoft data center before, just by installing that agent. So that's pretty awesome. And then you can manage how you deploy cloud-native applications into any CNCF-compliant Kubernetes environment as well. So Azure Arc for Kubernetes allows you to manage the deployment of Kubernetes applications into any environment that you want. So if you have on-premises VMware Tanzu, and you have EKS in Amazon, and you have AKS in Azure, I mean, I hope people don't, because that's a crazy world that they live in, but if they had all these different environments, then they have 3 different ways of deploying their Kubernetes applications to them and managing the life cycle of those. Azure Arc for Kubernetes allows you one consistent way to deploy into those and manage those as well, which is nice. It brings order to that multi-cloud chaos there. And then on top of that, we can start bringing these Azure Arc-enabled application services. So Azure App Service, Azure Functions, Azure Logic Apps, Azure Event Grid, and then on with some Azure Arc-enabled data services like Azure SQL Managed Instances, Azure Postgres, and Azure Machine Learning. This is the tip of the spear here. This is the start of this bringing of Azure services down to on-premises, and it's super important that we don't look at this as an end state. This is day one. These are the ones which have been enabled, largely because they're all about data, and data is often the thing that's hard to move into an Azure data center, so why not bring the service to where the data is instead? So bring Azure Postgres SQL on-premises and then just shift that data in there and have it as that modernized Azure service on-premise there. Do the same with Azure SQL Managed Instances. Bring Azure Machine Learning to your existing Oracle databases on-premises, whatever you want, without having to move it all the way to the public cloud there. It's bring the service to you, not you have to go to the service. And for me, that's pretty awesome. What I want to focus in on here, though, in terms of infrastructure, is not VxRail, it's not PowerFlex, it's not PowerMax, it's not PowerStore, it's not all these other Dell things. It is the piece that we've built with Microsoft, which has the deepest Azure Arc integration, which is designed to be Azure hybrid by default or by design, and that is Azure Stack HCI. And Azure Stack HCI launched from Microsoft as a new operating system almost 2 years ago now. It was in February, I think, 2 years ago. So we are a little bit into that, but don't be fooled. That doesn't mean that it's a new thing. Azure Stack HCI as an operating system is basically a fork of Windows Server, and it uses the same features that were in Windows Server previously. So when Windows Server 2016 launched, that was its first foray into hyperconverged infrastructure there. That's when Storage Spaces Direct first came on the scene, and we immediately started building reference architectures with Microsoft for that. We've iterated every year since and made that better, better, better. We've moved from having a reference architecture to having ready nodes to a validated system and now to an integrated system here. And through that time, we've deployed to 1,600 plus customers, over 11,000 nodes, and we have over an exabyte of capacity deployed on Storage Spaces Direct. This is not new to us. This is something that we are extremely deep in, and I can't tell you the market share that we have, but it is, well, more than our next two biggest competitors combined, we'll say, in terms of Azure Stack HCI running on anyone else's hardware. We are absolutely deep in this and committed to delivering Azure Stack HCI with Microsoft here. And the whole point of Azure Stack HCI is to do these, well, three things. Any hyperconverged infrastructure is designed to streamline and simplify your operations. That is core to the mission of any HCI platform. Simplify how you do things, shrink down your footprint, reduce power, that's probably an important thing these days, and give you one thing to manage rather than potentially 2 or 3 different things, storage, network, compute, have it all inside the one box there. So that is built in there. This is an enterprise class experience. This isn't designed to be a DIY, cobble it together, hope it works approach. This is an enterprise class product that you can buy, deploy. It'll be as robust on day 1, day 2 as day 1,000, day 2,000, however long you buy the support for. It is designed to be that continuously validated and tested platform between Dell and Microsoft for the lifetime of the product there. But fundamentally, this is an Azure integrated experience. This isn't an instead of. It's not a because we don't want to. This is for Azure customers. This is for people who want to use Azure, but there's a need to have some things on premises, and that tends to be most people that we find. Whenever you go into an Azure migration journey, there are the low-hanging fruit. There are things that you say, yes, we can move those easily. And then here are the ones that take a bit more time. And then it's the, oh, God, how do we do those? And maybe it's because of latency. Maybe it's because of an old-fashioned licensing model. Maybe it's because of data sovereignty or security or any number of other reasons. But these workloads need to remain in an on-premises environment. Well, bringing consistency to that, having one way of doing things. I'll never use the term single pane of glass because that is an abomination. Your laptop screen is your single pane of glass. But Azure Arc and the Azure Portal are trying to become that one place to go to manage anything, whether it's on-prem or in the Azure public cloud there. From an architectural perspective, this is what Azure Stack HCI looks like here. So down at the bottom, but by no means the least important, is the Dell EMC integrated system for Azure Stack HCI. This is anything from 1 node up to 16 nodes in a cluster. We can do a single node cluster, and it's fully supported. So for your edge locations, for your small scale environments, 1 node absolutely viable there. Up to 16 nodes. from single socket up to, well, some really fast AMD offerings there as well. I've got a slide on that, which I won't belabor, but anything and everything you want there from an ecosystem perspective. I kind of like this slide as well because it almost breaks down the cost pieces as well in this, because yes, you have to buy the hardware there. It doesn't break the bank. This is not a ridiculously expensive platform. Then you license the Azure Stack HCI operating system that sits on top of that. So 2 ways to license the Azure Stack HCI operating system. Number 1, you can pay for it through Azure credits, so it's licensed through an Azure subscription, $10 per physical core per month in that infrastructure, all in. That gets you every feature in Azure Stack HCI. No additional cost for your software-defined storage or networking or anything like that. Just that one cost, and you have Azure Stack HCI there. Or if you have Windows Server Data Center licenses with software assurance, then you get every single feature in there out of the box already as well. So let's say you already have an existing on-premises infrastructure. You have Windows Server Data Center licenses with software assurance. If you buy the hardware for Azure Stack HCI, you can move those licenses across, and there is no additional license cost for Azure Stack HCI. It's just built in there. That is an Azure hybrid benefit there that you get there. So it could be 0 additional license cost for you if you already have those licenses. That's nice. If you already have those data center licenses, Azure Kubernetes Service is also included in that cost as well, so no additional cost for that. So Windows Server Data Center licenses with software assurance, great way to get a whole bunch of this capabilities here. Your virtual machines, Linux virtual machines, maybe no additional cost there. Windows virtual machines, again, traditional Windows Server licensing there. It can be a Windows Server Standard license, data center license, or you could pay for it through an Azure subscription as well, which is unique to Azure Stack HCI. However you choose to do this, flexible in whether you're using traditional sort of CapEx mechanisms for buying your licensing or paying through an Azure subscription. All of those absolutely viable. In terms of the use cases that we see for Azure Stack HCI, they are not niche. They are many and varied. They're everything from Windows Server and Hyper-V refresh from older versions of Windows or older versions of Hyper-V, right through to running these Azure services on premises and everything in between. I'm going to call out 2 of these though, or maybe 3 of these. Number 1 is that you get a benefit by moving Windows Server 2008 or in 2012 workloads into Azure Stack HCI, which is you get 3 years of free security updates with those. So move them into Azure Stack HCI, 3 years of free security updates. Move them into Azure, 3 years of free security updates. And that can give you a breathing space to upgrade and modernize those 2008 or soon 2012 workloads as well, without worrying about being out of compliance and out of support there. Virtual desktop infrastructure, VDI with Azure Virtual Desktop. This is a super important one, because through COVID, we saw a lot of customers deploying VDI solutions in AVD, but also butting up against some of the boundaries that you hit when you start deploying AVD inside the Microsoft data centers. So AVD, a wonderful service, but sometimes the latency, either to the client or to other applications on premises, was not great, and sometimes data sovereignty required application data to remain on premises as well. So AVD in Azure Stack HCI is the exact same service as in public Azure. You go to the AVD portal in portal.azure.com, you choose to deploy your host pools, and you just choose to deploy it into your Azure Stack HCI infrastructure instead of an Azure data center. Exact same service and the exact same experience in how you deploy AVD there as well. And finally, I'll touch on the remote office and branch office scenario here, because we can do 1, 2, 3, or 4 node configurations with no storage switches required. So the ability to back-to-back connect these 1, 2, 3, or 4 node configurations there and have storage traffic go over those means you don't necessarily need to modernize your network infrastructure at branch offices or edge locations. So you can bring in small-scale infrastructure, very easy to manage, project that into the Azure portal, have one place to manage lots of different sites, and start bringing Azure services to those as well. So extremely cost-effective, very easy to manage, very easy to roll out at large scale as well, and we're especially seeing that in manufacturing, retail, fast food restaurants, things like that, where they want to deploy these at many, many sites and manage in one location there as well. I said I wouldn't belabor the hardware, so I won't, but if you want to go through the hardware in more detail with me later, then I will be available all day, so feel free to come through and go through all our hardware offerings there with me later. Windows Admin Center, hands up if you've never used Windows Admin Center. Everyone's used Windows Admin. Hands up if you have used Windows Admin Center. Fantastic. That's basically everyone. Top tip, did you know that you can go to aka.ms/whack download and it'll just give you the installer? You don't need to go through the sign up to download it. Just aka.ms/whack download and you can get that installer directly from there, which saves you having to put in all your details to download it. Windows Admin Center is the management plane for Azure Stack HCI. It has a bunch of Azure hybrid capabilities built in, so it has Azure Backup, Azure Monitor, Azure Network Adapter, Site Recovery, things like that you want to configure from within Windows Admin Center. Those are all built in there. So what you're managing is Azure capabilities, you're managing the deployment of your workloads, you're managing your AKS infrastructure, you're managing your software-defined storage, software-defined networking, you're managing, well, everything within that, and we wanted to make sure you could also manage everything from the hardware down as well. So we started building a whole bunch of Dell integrations for Azure Stack HCI as well. So if you log into the Windows Admin Center console, you will also be able to manage all of the underlying Dell infrastructure within that as well. So yes, you can do cluster monitoring and management. I would say that this is table stakes. We delivered this in 2017, I think, as our first capability in Windows Admin Center here, and we've just evolved from here. I say it's table stakes, but you'd be surprised how many OEMs do not even have this basic capability built into Windows Admin Center here. We have the ability to do automated cluster creation. So if you're doing your initial deployment of Azure Stack HCI, being able to go through a very simple GUI-driven wizard for deploying it, that's built in here as well. It'll ensure that all the hardware is up to date, the BIOS drivers firmware are at the right level, every piece of hardware is at the same state, and that it's going to work before you start the deployment, so it makes it extremely straightforward there as well. And then we have the same for cluster expansion. So you've bought a 4-node cluster, you want to make that a 6-node cluster, so you buy 2 more, bring them in. It's going to make sure that all the BIOS drivers and firmware are at the same level, make sure that everything is consistent and contiguous, and then do that deployment and expand your cluster there in an extremely straightforward way. And yes, actually, we do support customer deployment of Azure Stack HCI as well, which is fairly unique for some of these sorts of offerings. Probably the most important thing that we've added to Azure Stack HCI is this one-click full-stack lifecycle management. I think when we talk to our customers, we see over and over again that the hardest thing about running stuff on premises is maintaining that patch and update of the hardware. That's one of the reasons why Azure services are so attractive, because you don't need to do that. So within Azure Stack HCI, we've built in the capability to do, well, it says 1 click. It's really 4 clicks because you have to click next, 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 next to actually initiate it. But once you do that, all of the Dell and Microsoft updates that are available will be deployed across that cluster with no downtime to the workloads there. So incredibly straightforward to stay up to date with your updates, continuously validated by Dell and Microsoft there through the lifetime of the product there. So extremely simple to keep your updates flowing there as well. And you can schedule those as well. If you don't want to be the person clicking go on a Sunday night, you can schedule it to run when you're good to go there as well. Okay, in terms of implementation, we have 3 options there basically. You can use Dell Pro Deploy, you can use a partner like Computer World, or customer deployment is available as well. Recommend using a partner or Dell Pro Deploy just because unless you're doing it 100 times yourself, why put in the effort to become an expert in deployment? And we do make it easy, but it's always easier with a partner, so definitely recommend doing that. One thing which is not optional is that we include single source support for all of our Azure Stack HCI deployments as well. So if you call in to Dell with a problem and it turns out to be a Microsoft issue, we will manage the resolution of that behind the scenes. We have a joint ticketing system with Microsoft where we can pass tickets back and forth, maintain the ownership of that, so there's never any finger pointing. We will never say, that's not our problem, go to Microsoft. They'll never hopefully say, that's a Dell problem, go to Dell. We have that joint ticketing solution there to make sure that it is a one-stop shop for support as well, regardless of where an issue lies. So, rounding out. Why the Dell EMC integrated system for Azure Stack HCI? Well, it is a fully productized solution. This is not DIY. It is designed to be an Azure integrated solution. It's a better together story with Azure. If you are an Azure customer and you need to run things on premises, this is your Dell and Microsoft designed solution for running those services where you want to, where you need to, on premises there as well. And we do have that fully integrated lifecycle management capability built in there. So yeah, Dell Technologies, #1 server vendor in the world, #1 HCI system segment vendor in the world. Little known fact, #1 Microsoft HCI vendor in the world as well. There is no more Microsoft HCI deployed on anyone than Dell, and we have over 30 years of experience working closely with Microsoft, with joint solution validation. Our support engineers are in the same physical premises as some of the Microsoft ones as well, and we really do design this as a co-engineered solution to make sure that when you are an Azure customer and you need to run things on premises, you can be an Azure customer wherever you need to be, not just in the bounds of those Microsoft facilities. So any questions you have, I'll be around all day. You can see that I've got a lot of content to get out of me, and I want to push it through you all, so we'll chat all day. But with that, I think I'm at time, so pass back to you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kenny.